Sarah wiped down the counter for the third time that morning, her hands shaking slightly as she watched the rain streak down the cafe windows. The small coffee shop had been her sanctuary for 2 years, a place where she could forget about her troubles and focus on making perfect lattes and warm smiles for customers. At 28, Sarah had learned that life rarely went according to plan. After losing her previous job at a marketing firm due to company downsizing, she had taken the cafe position out of necessity. The pay wasn't much, but her boss, Mrs. Henderson, was kind. And the regular customers had become like family to her. The bell above the door chimed, and Sarah looked up to see a man in a crisp military uniform entering. His posture was straight, his movements precise, and there was something about his eyes that spoke of someone who had seen too much. Rain dripped from his coat as he approached the counter, his boots clicking against the old wooden floor. "Good morning," Sarah said with her usual warm smile. "What can I get you today?" The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the menu board above her head. "Just a black coffee, please. Large." As Sarah prepared his order, she noticed his hands trembling slightly when he reached for his wallet. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. His uniform bore the insignia of the Royal Guard, and she found herself curious about his story. "Here you go," she said, sliding the steaming cup across the counter. "That'll be $3.50. The man fumbled with his wallet, and Sarah watched as several coins scattered across the floor. His face flushed red with embarrassment as he bent to collect them, his movements awkward and hurried. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not usually so clumsy." Sarah's heart went out to him. She had seen that look before, the haunted expression of someone struggling with invisible wounds. Without thinking, she reached under the counter where Mrs. Henderson kept a small emergency fund for customers who came up short. "Don't worry about it," she said gently, waving away his attempts to count out the exact change. "The coffee's on the house today." The man looked up at her with surprise, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't have to do that. I can pay." "I know you can," Sarah replied softly. "But sometimes we all need a little kindness from strangers." For a moment, they stood in silence, the only sound being the gentle patter of rain against the windows and the soft jazz music playing in the background. The man's shoulders seemed to relax slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice was steadier. "Thank you," he said simply. "You have no idea what this means to me." Sarah smiled and nodded, watching as he found a corner table by the window. Something about his gratitude touched her deeply, and she found herself hoping he would return. Little did she know that this small act of kindness would set in motion a series of events that would change her life forever. As the morning wore on, other customers came and went, but Sarah found her attention drifting back to the uniformed man by the window. He sat quietly, nursing his coffee and staring out at the rain-soaked street. There was a loneliness about him that reminded her of her own struggles, and she felt a connection she couldn't quite explain. When he finally stood to leave, he approached the counter once more. This time, his movements were more confident, his shoulders squared with military precision. "I never got your name," he said quietly. "Sarah," she replied. "Sarah Mitchell." "Thank you, Sarah Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "I'm David Thompson. And what you did today, ... It meant more than you know." As he left the cafe, Sarah watched him disappear into the rain, unaware that their brief encounter had been observed by others who would soon make their presence known in ways she never could have imagined. David Thompson became a regular at the cafe over the next 2 weeks. Every morning at exactly 9:15, he would enter with the same precise movements, order the same black coffee, and sit at the same table by the window. Sarah began to look forward to his visits, their brief conversations gradually revealing pieces of his story. He had served 3 tours overseas. He told her one rainy Tuesday and was now part of the Royal Guard's ceremonial unit. The nightmares had started after his last deployment, he admitted quietly, and some mornings it was hard to face the world. Sarah listened without judgment, refilling his cup and offering the kind of understanding that comes from someone who has faced their own demons. "You know," David said one morning, his voice barely audible over the espresso machine, "you're the first person who hasn't looked at me like I'm broken." Sarah paused in her wiping of the counter. "We're all broken in some way," she replied gently. The trick is finding people who don't mind helping you pick up the pieces. Their friendship had developed naturally, built on shared silences and small kindnesses. David had even started arriving earlier some days, helping Sarah arrange chairs and sharing stories about his fellow guards. She learned that he sent most of his paycheck home to his sick mother in Scotland, that he hadn't had a real friend in years, and that her cafe had become his safe harbor in a world that often felt hostile. But their peaceful routine was shattered on a gray Thursday morning when Mrs. Henderson called Ray into the back office. The older woman's face was stern, her lips pressed into a thin line that Sarah had never seen before. "Sarah, we need to talk," Mrs. Henderson said, closing the door behind them. "I've been getting complaints." Complaints. Sarah's heart sank. "About what?" "About you giving away free coffee to that soldier," Mrs. Henderson replied, her voice cold. "Multiple customers have noticed, and word is getting around that we're running some kind of charity operation here." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "Mrs. Henderson, it was only a few times, and I paid for it myself from my tip jar." "I didn't think you didn't think," Mrs. Henderson interrupted. "That's exactly the problem. This is a business, not a soup kitchen. I can't have employees making executive decisions about who gets free handouts." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Sarah trying desperately to explain her actions while Mrs. Henderson remained unmoved. The older woman had built her cafe from nothing, she reminded Sarah, and couldn't afford to have her reputation damaged by rumors of favoritism or poor business practices. "I'm sorry." "Sarah," Mrs. Henderson finally said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all, "I'm going to have to let you go. Your last day will be Friday." Sarah felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. The cafe was more than just a job to her. It was her community, her sense of purpose, her financial lifeline. Losing it over an act of kindness felt like a cruel joke. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, "give me another chance. I promise it won't happen again." But Mrs. Henderson's mind was made up. She handed Sarah a final paycheck and asked her to clear out her locker. As Sarah gathered her few personal belongings, a coffee-stained apron, a small plant from her counter space, a photo of her late father, she felt tears threatening to spill over. The worst part was knowing she would have to tell David, when he arrived the next morning, for what would unknowingly be their last regular encounter. Sarah struggled to find the words. He noticed her red-rimmed eyes immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked, his military training making him alert to signs of distress. Sarah told him everything, her voice barely steady as she explained Mrs. Henderson's decision. David's face grew darker with each word, his jaw clenching with barely controlled anger. "This is my fault," he said quietly. "If I hadn't been so pathetic that first day—" "No," Sarah interrupted firmly. "Don't you dare blame yourself. I made a choice to be kind, and I don't regret it." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their impending separation settling between them. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. "This has my number," he said. "If you need anything at all, you call me. I mean it." Sarah took the card with shaking hands, knowing that after today she might never see him again. As she served him his final cup of coffee, neither of them could have predicted that within hours. Their story would take a dramatic turn that would bring armed Marines to the cafe's doorstep. Sarah's final shift at the cafe ended at 6 o'clock on Friday evening. She had said her goodbyes to the regular customers throughout the day, each farewell feeling like a small death. The afternoon had dragged by painfully slowly, with Mrs. Henderson avoiding eye contact and maintaining an uncomfortable silence whenever they were. In the same room as Sarah hung up her apron for the last time, she felt utterly lost. Her savings account held barely enough for next month's rent, and job prospects in the small town were limited. She had spent the day trying to remain professional, but inside she was falling apart. David had stopped by during his lunch break, bringing her a small bouquet of flowers from the shop down the street. "For new beginnings," he had said quietly, though they both knew how uncertain her future looked. He had tried to give her money to tide her over, but she had refused. Not wanting to burden him further, that evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment above the bakery, staring at her laptop screen as she scrolled through job listings. Most required experience she didn't have, or paid far less than what she needed to survive? The rejection felt overwhelming, and for the first time since losing her marketing job, she wondered if she would have to move back in with her aunt in the city. Meanwhile, across town at the military barracks, David was having trouble sleeping. The injustice of Sarah's firing ate at him, and he found himself pacing his small quarters, replaying their conversations over the past weeks. She had been the one bright spot in his difficult transition back to civilian-adjacent life, and knowing that her kindness had cost her everything made his chest tight with rage, unable to settle. David made his way to the common room where several other guards were watching television. Among them was Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, a career military man who had become something of a mentor to David. "Since his assignment to the ceremonial unit, you look like hell," Thompson Marcus observed as David slumped into a chair. "What's eating you?" David found himself telling the whole story about Sarah's kindness, their friendship, and her unfair dismissal. As he spoke, other soldiers gathered around, listening with growing interest and indignation. "That's messed up," said Corporal James Wright, a young man from Texas who had joined the conversation. "Girl loses her job for being decent to a fellow soldier." "Happens more than you'd think," Marcus said grimly. "Some people don't understand what it's like coming back. They see the uniform and think we're all fine. Or they see someone struggling and want nothing to do with it." The group continued talking late into the night, with David sharing more details about Sarah's situation. What he didn't know was that Marcus had connections beyond the ceremonial unit. Before joining the Royal Guard, he had served with an elite Marine reconnaissance team, and several of his former squad mates were currently stationed at a nearby base. The next morning, Marcus made a phone call to his old friend, Master Sergeant Tony Chen, who led a Marine unit specializing in community outreach and veteran support. When Marcus explained David's situation, Tony listened with growing interest. You know what Tony said after hearing the full story? "We've been looking for good community partnerships for our veteran support program. Maybe it's time we paid this cafe a visit." What Marcus didn't mention to David was that Tony's unit had been investigating reports of discrimination against service members and local businesses. Sarah's firing could be seen as exactly the kind of case they were trained to address. Though their methods were often more dramatic than traditional advocacy, Tony assembled a team of 12 Marines, all veterans themselves who understood the importance of civilian support networks. Their plan was simple: make a statement about how the community should treat those who serve, while also ensuring that good people like Sarah weren't punished for their kindness. On Saturday afternoon, while Sarah was at the unemployment office filing paperwork, Tony's Marines were conducting reconnaissance of the cafe. They observed the foot traffic, noted the layout, and confirmed Mrs. Henderson's presence. What they found was a business owner who seemed more concerned with appearances than with doing the right thing. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform a simple story of workplace injustice into something much larger, a powerful demonstration of military brotherhood in the lengths good soldiers will go to protect those who protect them. By evening, David had no idea that his casual conversation in the common room had set in motion a chain of events that would bring armed Marines to Henderson's CAF within 24 hours. All he knew was that Sarah was hurting, and he felt powerless to help her. That feeling of powerlessness was about to change in a way he never could have imagined. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzly, with Sarah waking to the sound of rain against her apartment windows. She had barely slept, her mind racing with worries about rent, bills, and an uncertain future. The phone call from David the night before had helped a little. He had promised to keep asking around about job opportunities, but she still felt like she was drowning at Henderson's CAF. Mrs. Henderson was preparing for the morning rush with her temporary replacement, a teenager named Kelly, who had never worked in food service before. The older woman was already regretting her hasty decision to fire Sarah, as Kelly had burned 3 batches of muffins and couldn't figure out how to work the espresso machine properly. At exactly 10:30, the cafe's front door opened with such force that the bell above it chimed frantically. Mrs. Henderson looked up from the cash register to see 12 Marines in full dress, uniform filing through the entrance in perfect formation. Their movements were precise, their faces serious, and their presence filled the small space with an air of official business. Master Sergeant Tony Chen stepped forward, his insignia glinting under the cafe's fluorescent lights. He was a compact man with graying temples and eyes that had seen combat in 3 different countries. Behind him, his Marines stood at attention, creating an impressive wall of military bearing. "Ma'am," Tony said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Master Sergeant Chen with the Marine Corps Community Outreach Division. We need to speak with the owner of this establishment." Mrs. Henderson's face went pale. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her apron, her eyes darting nervously between the Marines. Kelly, the teenage employee, had retreated behind the counter, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm the owner," Mrs. Henderson stammered. "Is there some kind of problem?" Tony pulled out a small notebook and flipped it open, his movements deliberate and effective. "We've received reports about the treatment of military personnel at this establishment. Specifically, the termination of an employee who provided assistance to a member of the Royal Guard." The cafe had gone completely silent. The few customers who had been enjoying their morning coffee were now staring at the scene unfolding before them. One woman discreetly pulled out her phone and began recording. Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. There must be some misunderstanding. I run a respectable business. I support our troops. Is that so?" Tony asked, his tone neutral but intimidating. "Then perhaps you can explain why Sarah Mitchell was fired for showing kindness to one of our brothers in arms." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Mrs. Henderson glanced around the room, suddenly aware that everyone was waiting for her answer. The Marines remained perfectly still, their collective presence making the small cafe feel even smaller. "That's a private employment matter," Mrs. Henderson finally managed. "I don't see how it concerns the military." Tony took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Ma'am, when someone in uniform is struggling, and a civilian shows them kindness, that concerns all of us. When that civilian is then punished for their compassion, it becomes our business very quickly." Behind Tony, the other Marines remained silent, but their message was clear. They stood like a wall of solidarity, each one representing countless others who understood what it meant to need support during difficult times. One of the Marines, a tall woman with corporal's stripes, spoke up. "We've done our research, ma'am. Sarah Mitchell paid for that coffee out of her own tips. She broke no company policies regarding inventory or cash handling. She was fired because you were embarrassed by complaints from customers, who apparently don't understand what service and sacrifice mean." Mrs. Henderson's face flushed red. "You can't just storm into my business and intimidate me. This is America. I have rights." "Yes, ma'am, you do," Tony agreed calmly. "And so do the men and women who serve this country, including the right to be treated with basic human decency when they're struggling." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Kelly had completely disappeared into the back room, leaving Mrs. Henderson alone to face the Marines. The customers watched in fascination and growing sympathy for the military personnel making their stand. Tony pulled out his phone and dialed a number. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Hello, Sarah, this is Master Sergeant Chen. I'm a friend of David Thompson's. Could you come down to Henderson's Café right away? We have something important to discuss with you." Sarah's voice was confused, but curious. Yes, I can be there in 10 minutes. Is everything okay?" "Everything's going to be just fine," Tony replied, his eyes never leaving Mrs. Henderson's face. "We're making sure of it," as Tony hung up the phone. The Marines continued their silent vigil. Mrs. Henderson realized that this was far from over, and that her decision to fire Sarah was about to have consequences she never could have imagined. Sarah hurried down the street toward the cafe, her heart racing with confusion and concern. Master Sergeant Chen's phone call had been brief, but urgent, and she couldn't imagine why the Marines would be involved in her situation. As she rounded the corner, she stopped dead in her tracks. 12 Marines in full-dress uniforms stood in formation outside Henderson's Café, their presence drawing curious onlookers from up and down the street. People had gathered on the sidewalk, some taking photos, others whispering among themselves about what could possibly be happening. Sarah approached cautiously, recognizing none of the Marines but feeling an odd sense of protection from their presence. The lead Marine, whose name tape read Chen, stepped forward and extended his hand. "Miss Mitchell, I'm Master Sergeant Chen. David Thompson asked some friends to look into your situation." "David did this?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. "David told his story to the right people," Tony explained gently. "And we decided that sometimes good people need backup when they're fighting the right fight." Tony gestured toward the cafe, where Mrs. Henderson could be seen through the window, pacing nervously behind the counter. "We've been having a conversation with the owner about community values and supporting our service members." Sarah felt overwhelmed. "I appreciate this, but I don't want any trouble. I just want to move on, Miss Mitchell," said the female Marine, who had spoken earlier. "With respect, this isn't just about you anymore. This is about setting a standard for how civilians treat military personnel in crisis. David Thompson is a decorated veteran who served 3 combat tours. When he was struggling, you showed him kindness. You shouldn't be punished for that." Tony nodded toward the cafe. "Would you mind coming inside? We have a proposition for Mrs. Henderson, but we wanted you to hear it too." Hey. Sarah followed the Marines into the cafe, feeling like she was in some kind of dream. The few customers inside looked up with intense curiosity, and Mrs. Henderson's face went from pale to green when she saw Sarah enter with the military escort. "Here's what's going to happen," Tony announced, his voice carrying clearly through the small space. "Mrs. Henderson, you have 2 choices. First choice, you can reinstate Miss Mitchell immediately, with a formal apology and back pay for the days she's missed." Mrs. Henderson started to protest, but Tony held up his hand. "Second choice, we file a formal complaint with the Better Business Bureau, the Chamber of Commerce, and every military support organization in the state. It's about discrimination against service members and those who support them. We also make sure every veteran in a 50-mile radius knows exactly how this establishment treats people who show kindness to struggling soldiers." The room fell completely silent. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat as she processed what was happening. These Marines were going to bat for her, a complete stranger. Simply because she had shown kindness to one of their own, Mrs. Henderson looked around the room desperately, as if hoping someone would rescue her from this situation. Instead, she saw faces of disapproval from her customers, some of whom were nodding in agreement with the Marines. "This is extortion," she whispered. "No, ma'am," Tony replied calmly. "This is consequences. You made a choice to punish someone for kindness. We're giving you a chance to make a better choice." An elderly man sitting in the corner booth stood up slowly. Sarah recognized him as Mr. Peterson, a regular customer who always ordered a plain coffee and read the newspaper quietly. "I've been coming here for 3 years, Mr. Peterson said, his voice shaky but determined. "Sarah is the best thing that ever happened to this place. She remembers everyone's order, asks about our families, treats every person who walks through that door like they matter. If you don't hire her back, you'll lose more than just military customers." A woman at another table nodded vigorously. "He's right. Sarah made this place special. Without her, it's just another coffee shop." Mrs. Henderson looked around the room, seeing support for Sarah everywhere she turned. The Marines stood silently, letting the community voices speak for themselves. Finally, Mrs. Henderson's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Fine," she said quietly. "Sarah, would you consider coming back?" Sarah looked at the Marines, at the customers who had spoken up for her, and at Mrs. Henderson's reluctant but genuine offer. She thought about David, wherever he was, and how a simple act of kindness had somehow mobilized an entire community. "I'll come back," she said finally, "but with conditions." Tony smiled slightly. "What conditions, Miss Mitchell?" Sarah straightened her shoulders, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I want a written guarantee that showing compassion to customers, especially military personnel, will never be grounds for termination. And I want Mrs. Henderson to establish a policy that any veteran or active service member having a difficult day gets their first cup of coffee free. No questions asked." The Marines exchanged approving glances. Mrs. Henderson, realizing she had no choice, nodded her agreement. Deal, she said weakly. Tony extended his hand to Sarah. Miss Mitchell, it's been an honor. David Thompson has good instincts about people. As the Marines prepared to leave, Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. Strangers had risked their time and reputations to stand up for her, all because one lonely veteran had shared her story with the right people. Word of the Marine intervention at Henderson's Café spread through the town like wildfire. By Monday morning, local news crews were stationed outside, and the story had been picked up by regional papers. Sarah found herself at the center of a narrative about community support, military solidarity, and the power of standing up for what's right. David Thompson arrived at the cafe at his usual time. But instead of his typical quiet entrance, he was greeted by applause from the customers inside. Sarah beamed at him from behind the counter, wearing her apron again, and looking more confident than he had ever seen her. "I can't believe you did all this," she said, pouring his regular black coffee. "You turned my whole world around." David shook his head, his eyes bright with emotion. "I didn't do anything special. I just told some good people about another good person who deserved better." The cafe was busier than it had ever been. Veterans from the surrounding area had made pilgrimages to see the place where their brothers in arms had made a stand. Civilians came out of curiosity and stayed because of Sarah's genuine warmth and the cafe's newfound reputation for treating everyone with dignity. Mrs. Henderson had undergone a remarkable transformation as well. The public attention and community pressure had forced her to confront her own prejudices and business practices. She approached Sarah during the lunch lull, her manner humble and apologetic. "Sarah, I owe you more than just your job back," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about what those Marines said, about community values and supporting people when they're struggling. I was wrong to fire you, but more than that, I was wrong about what this place should represent." Sarah looked up from the espresso machine, surprised by Mrs. Henderson's sincere tone. "I want to do better," Mrs. Henderson continued. "Not just because of the publicity, but because it's right. I want to expand on your idea about supporting veterans. Maybe we could partner with local military support groups, offer job training programs, even host support meetings here after hours." Sarah smiled, recognizing the genuine desire for change in her employer's voice. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Mrs. Henderson. This place has always had the potential to be more than just a cafe." Over the following weeks, Henderson's Café transformed into a community hub. The Kindness Cup program, offering free coffee to struggling veterans, attracted national attention and inspired similar initiatives across the country. Sarah found herself featured in magazine articles about civilian support for military personnel. Though she always insisted the real heroes were people like David who served their country with honor, Master Sergeant Chen and his Marines became regular visitors, often stopping by to check on their success story. Tony had been right about the power of making a statement. Other businesses in town began reviewing their own policies toward military personnel. In several established formal support programs, David's mental health improved dramatically with the support network that had grown around him. The cafe became a place where he could connect with other veterans, share experiences, and continue building his friendship with Sarah. His nightmares became less frequent, and he began talking about his future with hope instead of fear. 3 months after the Marine raid, Sarah received an unexpected job offer from a national veterans support organization, asking her to help develop community outreach programs across the country. The offer came with a substantial salary increase and the opportunity to travel, helping other communities build bridges between civilians and military personnel. She was torn about accepting. The cafe had become her home, and leaving felt like abandoning the community that had rallied around her. But David, ever the supportive friend, encouraged her to take the opportunity. "You changed my life by showing kindness to one person," he told her over their morning coffee. "Imagine how many lives you could touch if you took that kindness nationwide." On Sarah's last day at the cafe, the entire community turned out to see her off. The Marines who had stood up for her months earlier presented her with a certificate of appreciation and a promise that her story would be shared with military personnel everywhere as an example of the civilian support that exists when they need it. Mrs. Henderson, now a changed woman, promised to continue the programs Sarah had helped establish. The cafe had become profitable not just financially, but as a source of community pride and connection. As Sarah packed her car for the journey to her new position, David approached with a small wrapped package. "This is for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have something to remember this place by." Inside was a simple coffee mug with "Kindness changes everything" engraved on the side. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized how true those words had become. A story that began with a simple act of compassion, a free cup of coffee for a struggling veteran, had rippled outward in ways none of them could have imagined. Sarah's kindness had not only saved David from his darkest moments, but had mobilized an entire community to examine how they treated those who served as Sarah drove away toward her new adventure. She carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the smallest gestures can create the most profound changes. Behind her, Henderson's Café continued to serve as a beacon of community support, proving that when good people stand together, they can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The Marines had been right that day when they marched into the cafe. Sometimes good people need backup when they're fighting the right fight. But Sarah had learned something even more important. When you fight for kindness and compassion, you're never really fighting alone.